June 28th, 1914. Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie are in Sarajevo to inspect the Imperial Armed Forces when they are both shot at point-blank range by a 19-year-old Slavic nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. Enraged by this, Austria-Hungary sent a list of ridiculous demands to the Serbian government. The Serbians rejected these demands, and Austria-Hungary used this as an excuse to declare war on Serbia. Over the next month, due to many strange alliances and friendships, many countries ended up declaring war on each other, and the so-called Great War was started. The main countries for the Axis powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, while the Allies had Britain, France, Russia until the Russian Revolution, Italy, and additionally the US would later declare war on Germany in 1917. In January of 1917, both the Axis and the Allies were in a standstill across the western front of the war in the trenches. Both sides were running low on men and resources, and Germany was looking for something that would push them over the edge to win the war. The solution? A telegram sent from the German Foreign Office in January 1917 that proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico. The Germans tried to convince the Mexicans that France and the other allies were on the brink of surrendering, and that if the US did decide to join the war, then they would help them to gain back the lands they lost in the Mexican-American War, which was Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. When the Americans found out about the telegram, it pushed the country into hating Germany, and on April 6, 1917, the US declared war on Germany. The only problem was that the US was not ready to go to war. Over the following months, the US trained troops and built weapons for the war. The Allies were so desperate for manpower from the US that the US created an all-black National Guard unit that would go to war in Europe. They later became known as the Harlem Hellfighters. The Hellfighters faced discrimination in the army even before they got in the battlefield. This was during their training for war. The worst prejudice came at Camp Wadsworth in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where the city's citizens harassed them, nearly causing a race riot. Less than 2 weeks after being assigned to Camp Wadsworth, the Hellfighters were sent back to New York and then shipped to France with hardly any military training. When they arrived in France, they were discriminated against more, as they were not used on the front lines immediately. Instead, they were used as a source of cheap, manual labor, and were constantly watched over by white officers. Some soldiers said that this reminded them of the plantation system before the Civil War. Then, there was a major development in the war. Towards the end of 1917 and beginning of 1918, the Russian Revolution started, and one of the first things that Russia did was pull out of the war. This was a huge blow to the Allies because the only reason the French and British could hold back the Germans all this time on the Western Front was because of the Germans having to use a big chunk of their forces to fight against Russia in the East. Now that Russia was gone, Germany could focus all of its forces on the Western Front, which would most likely result in an Allied defeat if things stayed the same. France begged the US for troops to put on the front line. The US saw this as a great opportunity to unload the thousands of Hellfighters to the French to fight under the French flag, because the commanders and many troops did not want to fight alongside a quote-unquote inferior race. The US commanders also made it a point to alert the French commanders of the supposed rapist tendencies of the black troops. Gladly for them, the Hellfighters were treated very well by the French Fourth Army, which was the regiment that they were assigned to. The addition of the US and its black troops helped to propel the Allies to a victory in the war.
The French were begging at that time for soldiers. They needed soldiers. The Germans were just about ready to overwhelm the French at that time. And the United States Army got there just in the nick of time. And so the French got the Harlem Hellfighters. They served under the 4th French Army, and they went and stopped the Germans from invading the front lines of the French.
The Harlem Hellfighters had many triumphs and had a big part in the battle victories during World War I. Overall, they spent 191 days on the front lines, which was the most out of any U.S. regiment during the war. They fought in every major battle, including the Meuse-Argonne, which is still to today the bloodiest battle in U.S. history, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which ended up winning the war. The Hellfighters had an important victory when they captured the village of Seychelles from the Germans during the attack on the Hindenburg Line. Their biggest achievement, though, was being the first Allied regiment to cross the Rhine River and reach the inner parts of Germany. The German soldiers later said that they fought like fighters from hell, which is where they got their name, Hellfighters, from. They were so effective during the war that they never lost a foot of ground and never had a man taken prisoner. The French government was so proud of them that they awarded the entire regiment its highest honor, the Croix de Guerre, which is the equivalent to the Medal of Honor that we have here in America. A very good example of how passionate and dedicated these soldiers were was Private Henry Johnson. While standing watch in the Argonne Forest in May 1918, Private Johnson and another private named Roberts were attacked by a 12-man German raiding party. They were outgunned and outnumbered, but managed to fight off the initial attack. After being attacked again, Roberts was badly wounded and Johnson refused to leave his side so he wouldn't get captured. Johnson was also wounded himself. To save himself and his buddy, Johnson advanced on the enemy troops with only a bolo knife. He managed to kill one German soldier and made the rest of them retreat. Johnson and Roberts returned back to camp safely due to Johnson's heroic actions. Johnson was one of America's first war heroes, and his story was written in both the black and white newspapers across the country. Many people saw this and began to question their own beliefs about blacks. The story also pushed President Wilson to speak out against all the lynchings and violence against the blacks in the South. The citizens also wanted Johnson to win the Medal of Honor, but Wilson would not do that. Johnson ended up dying before he finally received his Medal of Honor from President Obama in 2015 at a White House award ceremony. He was only the second African American to receive this award. When the war ended, the Hellfighters were the first combat soldiers to return home from the Western Front and had a glorious parade up New York City's famed Fifth Avenue on February 17, 1919, almost 100 years ago exactly to today. The avenue was crowded with black and white citizens cheering them on. Some papers said that there was up to 5 million people there to watch and welcome home the troops.
It was an extraordinary parade, and whites and blacks stood together on the sidewalks of Fifth Avenue and cheered them on, and the band led the parade up Fifth Avenue. And when they crossed over into Harlem, the band started to play jazz music. But when they were coming up in Manhattan, they played, military music, marching music. But then they played jazz, and everybody went crazy. And then soldiers went back, and they were accepted for a while. But then, as time goes by, people began to forget.
The soldiers helped to gain some equality for blacks after the war, but sadly, quickly after, people forgot about what the Harlem Hellfighters did. Many African American veterans were shot or lynched while in uniform, trying to exercise all their rights as free citizens. In fact, in the year after the war ended, which was 1919, the Tuskegee Institute reported a 30% increase in lynchings. This number might be higher because many lynchings were not recorded down back then. The numerous lynchings combined with the second resurgence of the KKK during the 1920s made many people forget about what happened during World War I, and they went back to their old beliefs about African Americans. This resulted in the Red Summer of 1919, where there was the tragic mistreatment and killing of numerous African Americans in the U.S. This also forced the African American community to have to fight for another 45 years until they finally received rights when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed.